A lion burst free from its enclosure and sprinted directly toward an elderly man. Yet what followed plunged the entire park into stunned, breathless silence. On a sun-washed afternoon at the San Diego Wildlife Park, chaos erupted as a towering male lion smashed through a failed barrier and advanced toward the crowd. While visitors scattered in terror, one older man stood unmoving, his silver hair glowing softly under the light. And when the lion fixed its gaze on him and closed the distance, what unfolded felt like witnessing something sacred awaken after more than 2 decades. The summer sun hovered low above the San Diego Safari Wildlife Park, turning the air into a wavering haze that shimmered above the concrete paths. Families filled the central plaza, children tugging at sleeves, balloons bobbing lazily in the breeze, laughter mingling with distant animal calls into the comforting soundtrack of a familiar weekend outing. Everything felt ordinary, warm, bright, predictable until reality fractured with a single piercing metallic shriek. A thunderous crash rang across the plaza, sharp enough to hush the birds perched along the open walkways. For a heartbeat, no one grasped what had happened. Heads turned. Conversations froze. Ice cream cones hovered mid-lift. Then came another sound, deeper, heavier, the groan of reinforced steel, surrendering under pressure it was never designed to withstand. Visitors twisted toward the lion enclosure just in time to witness a section of fencing buckle inward, collapsing like thin cardboard. Dust erupted in a pale cloud. A woman screamed. A stroller tipped and clattered to the ground. Through the settling haze emerged a shape so immense and unmistakable that confusion instantly transformed into raw fear. A fully grown male lion stepped through the broken barrier muscles rolling beneath his tawny coat, his mane dark and thick like scorched amber beneath the California sun. Despite his size, his paws touched the ground with eerie quiet, each movement controlled, intentional. Sunlight caught the drifting dust, framing him in an almost unreal halo. For a fleeting moment, he simply stood there, surveying the open space as though rediscovering a world he had once known. Then panic exploded. Parents snatched children into their arms. Teenagers vaulted benches. A vendor abandoned his cart as it tipped and rolled down a gentle slope. The lion did not charge. He advanced slow, powerful, unhurried toward the center of the plaza, as if following a route visible only to him. His tail swayed in measured arcs, ears alert, eyes burning with instinct. A security guard shouted into his radio voice, cracking code red. Code red! Lion breach at the Central Plaza! Evacuate immediately! His words barely cut through the chaos as he tried to funnel the crowd toward emergency exits. Amid the stampede, a little girl tripped and fell frozen on her knees as the lion's shadow stretched across the concrete toward her. Her father fought against the fleeing mass, screaming her name, but the crowd pushed him back like a relentless tide. But the lion never looked at her. Something else had seized his attention. Roughly 20 yards away stood an elderly man motionless as bodies rushed past him. His hair was snow-white, his posture slightly bent by age. He did not run. He did not shout. His hands trembled faintly at his sides, yet his face remained calm, achingly calm. His pale blue eyes met the lion's amber gaze with an intensity that felt utterly out of place amid the terror. The lion halted mid-stride. His massive chest rose and fell. His nostrils flared as though catching a scent or a memory long buried. The noise of the plaza faded, not in reality, but in that strange way moments slow when two worlds collide. The old man, James Callahan, drew in a slow breath, not of fear but of recognition. The lion's pupils widened. His ears twitched. He stepped forward once, then again, ignoring the shouts, the fleeing feet, the tranquilizer rifles being shakily raised at the far edge of the plaza. James did not move. He could hear security pounding closer behind him, feel the ground tremble as people fled past. But standing before him was a creature he had not touched in 20 years yet, whose presence had lived inside his heart every single day since. The lion tilted his massive head just slightly, as if measuring the impossible. James whispered so softly he wasn't sure his voice survived the dust-filled air. Solomon. The lion's ears flicked at the sound. Dust settled around them like falling ash. The plaza held its breath. James took one small step forward. The motion was as natural as breathing, yet it carried him backward through time, straight into memories he had spent decades trying to preserve. That single step drained the air from his lungs, not from terror, but from the crushing weight of remembrance. As chaos churned behind him, James slipped not backward in space, but backward through years into a version of himself long buried. He was no longer a man in a wildlife park. He was the man who once believed he could save every living being placed in his care. The present demanded breath. James blinked. The lion remained frozen before him. The roar of the park softened into a distant hum as his pulse steadied. The disorder swirled around him, yet he remained anchored, his posture revealing not defiance but tenderness. This was not courage, it was not recklessness. It was recognition deeper than reason. James Callahan had lived 74 long years, most of them eroded into the quiet that settles over men who have lost too much. After retiring from the Santa Fe Fire Department, he kept the world at arm's length. His small wooden home, tucked near a tree line of stubborn ponderosa pines, smelled faintly of old smoke, worn leather, and pine needles drifting in through the screen door. Inside, his life had grown as still as the dust collecting on the mantel. Mornings were spent at a kitchen table too large for one, tracing the chipped rim of a mug with hands that once gripped fire hoses and pulled crying survivors from wreckage. Evenings meant listening to the lonely hum of the radio static blending with wind whispering through the forest. His daughter Meredith sent postcards now instead of calling sketches of Atlantic harbors, handwritten promises to visit soon. Soon had become a word without substance. And then there was the photograph. It stood propped beside the salt shaker where the sunrise could touch it. His wife Clara, captured 25 years ago, sitting on the hood of their old Ford Hair Wild from canyon wind laughter frozen mid-burst. Some mornings he spoke to the picture. Other days he could barely face it. Grief moved like tides when you lived alone. Yet every Saturday, without exception, James folded that photograph into his shirt pocket, buttoned his faded denim jacket, and drove the 2 hours west to the San Diego Safari Wildlife Park. His truck rattled along old highways, past rusted mailboxes and sun-bleached signs, the scenery shifting from pine-lined roads to rolling California scrubland. To strangers, he looked like just another elderly man filling a lonely weekend. But James never came for the giraffes or shaded benches. He came for one enclosure. He came for one lion. Even behind glass and steel, that lion unsettled him in ways nothing else could. Most visitors barely noticed the old man who always stood at the same spot near the left viewing pane. But the keepers noticed. They whispered about how the massive lion with the dark mane always rose when James arrived, how it moved low and deliberate to that exact place. Scent, one keeper suggested. Voice said another. James knew better. It was history. A truth he carried like a fragile ember kept alive by routine and heartbreak. He shared it with no one. Not the staff, not neighbors, not even his daughter. Partly from fear of disbelief, but mostly because the memory itself was sacred. So he lived quietly, fixed loose boards, mowed the lawn, watched evening skies bleed color across treetops. The world thought James Callahan had stepped out of life's current. It was wrong. The current still flowed towards something he could never release. Every Saturday, he felt the pull. He told himself he didn't need to go. He stood by his truck keys in hand, promising rest. But the thought of not seeing the lion tugged at him like an unfinished sentence. And so he drove. Because even if he could not explain it, he knew the truth. Every time he stood before that thick glass, the lion remembered him. The head tilt, the slow blink, the rumbling exhale, not imagination, familiarity, ancient, unbroken, just like now. As James stared into those amber eyes only yards away, years collapsed into a single thread. The lion took another careful step, muscles shifting beneath golden fur. Security shouted behind them. A tranquilizer team was called. A mother cried for her child. The lion ignored it all. James swallowed. Solomon. This time the lion's tail went still. His ears shifted sideways, not aggression, but searching. James's breath caught. That gesture, the pause, the recognition was the same as the very first night they met. The night that changed everything. As Solomon stepped closer, memory surged with undeniable clarity. It was time to remember what had bound them together in the first place. The scent of smoke, the snap and roar of fire, the frantic voices crackling over the radio, all of it rushed back as though 2 decades collapsed into a single breath. It had been late fall in New Mexico, the air cold and biting, sharp enough to burn the lungs. James was younger then, still carrying the solid power of a firefighter in his prime, assigned to what was expected to be an uneventful overnight shift. The station glowed faintly under dim lights, the buzz of fluorescence blending with the soft scrape of boots and the occasional cough from an exhausted crewman. But quiet shifts almost never stayed quiet. They had a way of turning sudden brutal and unforgiving, and that night followed the pattern. 1:14 a.m. The alarm bell screamed to life, its shrill cry ripping through the station. The dispatch voice crackled through the speakers. Warehouse fire on Old Timber Road. Possible chemical materials involved. Use extreme caution. In seconds, the crew surged into action. Jackets were yanked over shoulders, helmets snapped into place, hoses secured. The engine thundered forward, its deep growl vibrating through James's chest. By the time they arrived, the warehouse was already half consumed by flames. Fire poured skyward, casting long streaks of red and gold across smoke-choked darkness. The air burned with the stench of melting metal and aged timber. Sirens bounced off surrounding structures while embers danced wildly on the wind. James leapt from the truck before it fully stopped. Training and instinct guided him without conscious thought. He and his partner pushed toward the southern wall where the blaze burned fiercest. They waded into smoke so dense it felt like forcing their way through liquid shadow. As water blasted from their hoses, James caught a sound beneath the roar, faint, uneven, out of place. At first, he thought it was collapsing steel or a strained beam crying under pressure. Then he heard it again, a thin, trembling whimper, too small, too fragile. James's heart slammed. Without waiting, he turned toward the sound, motioning his partner away as the man shouted after him. Heat crushed against his gear as he moved deeper into the skeletal remains of the structure. The whimper came again, closer now, sharp with fear. He followed it to a pile of scorched crates, some still smoking, others soaked from earlier sprays. Behind fallen beams sat a single wooden box, edges blackened but not yet claimed by fire. Something inside shifted weakly, scraping softly. James dropped to his knees, shoved debris aside, and pried the lid open with the crowbar clipped to his belt. The moment it cracked open, two blue-gray eyes stared back at him through smoke and darkness. A lion cub, barely weeks old. Its golden fur was filthy and matted. Its small body trembled violently, ribs fluttering with shallow breaths. The cub whimpered again, the sound scarcely more than air. A leather strap was cinched tight around its neck, biting deep into the skin and leaving angry red grooves. James reached out slowly, his heart pounding harder than it ever had on any call. "Easy, little one," he murmured, his voice instinctively gentle despite the chaos surrounding them. The cub flinched, then nudged weakly toward his gloved hand, sensing safety. James lifted it, stunned by how impossibly light it felt. Even through his gear, he could feel the warmth draining from its body, its breathing faltering. Nothing about this made sense. But James didn't stop to question it. He turned and ran. Cradling the cub beneath his jacket to shield it from falling embers, he sprinted for the exit. Smoke coiled around him, heat biting into his arms and legs. His partner swore loudly when he saw what James carried. "Have you lost your mind? We can't take that thing. It's alive," James said, his voice steady though his hands shook. "And it won't be if we leave it." The hesitation lasted only a second. Then his partner nodded and cleared the path as they raced back to the truck. Inside the engine cab, James laid the cub gently across his lap and pulled off one glove to check for a heartbeat. Thin, weak, but there. The drive back to the station felt endless. Every bump threatened to steal the fragile life away. James whispered to the cub, though he didn't know why, only that he couldn't stop. "You're going to make it. Stay with me. Stay with me." The cub blinked slowly and pressed its nose into the fabric of his coat. That simple, instinctive movement melted something inside James that had been frozen since Clara died. A quiet, wounded part of him reached out and held tight. At the station, ignoring shocked stares, James rushed into the locker room where the air was clean and cool. He wrapped the cub in a dry towel and carefully loosened the leather strap until it slid free. A raw, bruised ring circled the cub's neck where it had cut deep. The cub whimpered softly. James stroked its head, his touch filled with a tenderness he hadn't shown anyone in years. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I've got you." It was the first promise he had spoken aloud since his wife's death. And the moment it left his mouth, he knew he would keep it no matter the cost, no matter the rules already broken. He didn't know who abandoned the cub in that burning warehouse. He didn't know what suffering it had endured before he found it. He only knew this fate had placed a fragile life in his hands, and he would not fail it. He would not walk away. That was the moment James Callahan's life changed forever. The night he pulled a lion cub from the fire was the night he unknowingly bound himself to Solomon for life, long before he ever spoke the name. James never forgot the noise Solomon made on the very first night they crossed paths. A shaky, uncertain vibration hovering somewhere between a purr and a whimper. It lingered in the wooden cabin long after the wail of fire truck sirens disappeared into the night. The cub lay bundled in a towel atop James's worn flannel jacket, its tiny chest lifting and sinking in uneven rhythms as if every breath required effort and permission from the world itself. The cabin, usually so quiet that James could hear timber contracting as it cooled after dark, suddenly felt filled with intention. He placed the cub carefully onto a folded blanket near the fireplace, keeping the flames low so the warmth wouldn't overwhelm its already weakened senses. The faint glow brushed the cub's fur in soft gold, revealing smudges of soot still clinging to its small frame. James crouched nearby, rinsed a bowl with unsteady hands, and filled it with warm water. The cub raised its head just slightly, sniffing the air. When its tongue finally touched the surface, James released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're stronger than you look," he whispered. And yet the truth remained. Solomon looked heartbreakingly delicate. That night James hardly slept. He drifted in and out of rest in a chair, one boot still on, jolting awake every few minutes to check the cub's breathing. Each time his hand hovered near the tiny rib cage and felt the faint rise and fall relief washed through him, awakening a tenderness in his chest that had lain dormant for years. He hadn't carried responsibility for a fragile life like this since Clara had been ill. Caring for this frightened creature, this small living spark of wilderness, forced his heart to move in ways he believed it no longer could. By morning, Solomon produced a low rumble that vibrated softly through the floorboards. It was no longer fear. It wasn't pain. It was trust. The days that followed unfolded slowly, quietly, with an almost sacred rhythm. James fed Solomon tiny amounts of warmed milk using a dropper later, transitioning to soft pieces of boiled chicken. At first, the cub struggled, shivering with every swallow. But after several days, he leaned toward the bowl, with growing intention, his appetite returning in cautious bursts. The injury around his neck demanded careful attention. Each time James cleaned the wound and replaced the bandage, Solomon whimpered but pressed his head into James's forearm as if acknowledging the hands that kept saving him. Outside the cabin, life marched on. Fire reports, inspections, the steady hum of Santa Fe. But inside those wooden walls, time slowed to the pace of breathing and heartbeats. In the evenings, James began talking to the cub, sharing memories of his wife, his years as a firefighter, the loneliness that had crept in after she was gone. "I didn't think anyone else would come along," he'd say, fingers moving gently over the cub's head. "Least of all you." Solomon gazed up with unblinking blue-gray eyes, absorbing the warmth in James's voice, if not the meaning of the words themselves. Soon the cub followed James from room to room, stumbling on paws too large for his growing body. When James sat at the table, Solomon curled around his boots. When he read the newspaper on the couch, Solomon tugged awkwardly at his jeans until James gave in and let the cub climb into his lap. One night, after a grueling shift, James dropped heavily into the armchair, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. Solomon waddled over and attempted to climb up. James laughed softly and lifted him onto his lap. The small lion curled into a tight ball and began to rumble again, the same gentle vibration from that first night, now steadier, more confident. The sound blended with the crackle of the fire, creating a peace James hadn't known in years. "You're healing," he murmured. And though he didn't yet understand it, so was he. Weeks slipped by, and Solomon grew not only in size but in assurance. His steps became surer, his muscles firmer, his playful spirit emerging with charming intensity. He sprang from behind furniture to ambush James's pant leg, or swatted dangling shoelaces with paws that were rapidly losing their tiny status. James found himself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time since Clara's death. The cabin, once echoing with emptiness, now brimmed with life. Scratches appeared across the wooden floor from sharpening claws. A lamp fell victim to an especially enthusiastic pounce. James didn't mind. He photographed everything, storing the pictures in a small metal box labeled Solomon's First Weeks, a quiet testament to how deeply the cub had claimed his heart. At night, when desert winds howled against the roof, Solomon climbed onto James's bed and curled against his chest, purring with a low, steady vibration that lulled James into sleep. It became their nightly ritual, a silent recognition of the bond growing between them. One evening, while James fixed a loose cabinet hinge, Solomon nudged a rubber ball toward him and made a small, demanding chirp. James set his tools aside, tossed the ball gently, and watched as the cub barreled after it with surprising speed. "You're going to be trouble," James said with a grin. Solomon returned, proudly dropping the ball into James's hands, tail swaying. It was then James realized the cub wasn't merely comfortable here. He was happy. Yet beneath the warmth of those weeks lay a truth James avoided. Cubs grow. Lions do not remain small no matter how much love surrounds them. Solomon was already heavier, stronger. One day his jaws would crush bone, his instincts would sharpen, and no matter how James tried to deny it, the outside world would eventually intrude upon their sanctuary. One cold morning, as Solomon raced through the front room and nearly toppled a table, a flicker of fear stirred in James. Not fear of the cub, but of the future rushing toward them. Solomon skidded to a halt and looked back, eyes bright, waiting for approval. James forced a smile. "Easy, buddy," he said quietly. "You're getting big." Solomon grunted softly and trotted back, pressing his forehead into James's knee. In that moment, pride and dread twisted together in James's chest. He knew what lay ahead. He knew these gentle, healing, miraculous days were limited. But he pushed the thought aside. For now, Solomon was safe in his arms, in his cabin, in this quiet life, forged from fire and second chances. For now, nothing could reach them. James bent down, scratched behind Solomon's growing ears, and whispered into the warm fur, "We'll figure it out, I promise." It was a vow he meant with every fiber of his being. One neither of them knew would be tested far sooner and far more painfully than either could imagine. The promise lingered for days afterward, delicate, yet warm, as though James's quiet words had spun an invisible thread around the little cabin, holding the outside world at bay. With every sunrise, Solomon grew stronger, heavier, more sure of himself. His paws, once hesitant and soft, now struck the wooden floor with dull, confident thuds. His playful jumps climbed higher, his small growls deepened into richer vibrations. He was still a cub, but no longer the fragile life James had carried from the burning warehouse. By the third month, Solomon weighed nearly 40 pounds, and though his affection never wavered, pressing his head to James's chest each morning, curling beside him each night, his instincts were shifting. He stalked flickering shadows, pounced at snowflakes, tapping the window pane, and trotted with the proud certainty of a creature discovering its place in the world. James noticed every change, every growth spurt, every sharpened movement, yet he clung fiercely to the moments that still felt small, Solomon nudging his hand for attention, drifting to sleep with his tail brushing across James's knee, watching him cook with those steady amber eyes. It was those quiet rituals that allowed James to forget, just for moments at a time. But truth does not vanish. Truth waits. And eventually it knocks. It came on a bitter morning just before winter fully claimed Santa Fe. Frost coated the porch steps, glittering under a pale, reluctant sun. James was splitting wood behind the cabin, his breath blooming white as the axe rose and fell. Nearby, Solomon roamed the small fenced area, swatting playfully at a loose rope James had tied to a beam, so the cub could entertain himself while James worked. James smiled each time Solomon pounced, awkward, powerful, growing. Then came a sound that made his heart jolt violently, a sharp intake of breath, followed by an angry, startled shout. "What in God's name is that?" James turned. At the edge of the property stood his neighbor, Harold Mills, a man with rigid posture and an even more rigid sense of order. Harold stared at Solomon, eyes wide, mouth frozen in disbelief. Solomon, curious, stopped mid-play and blinked calmly at the stranger. James's stomach dropped. "Harold," he began, carefully stepping between them. I can explain. That's a lion, Harold snapped, pointing with a shaking finger. A real damn lion in your yard. Solomon took a cautious step forward, not aggressive, merely studying the unfamiliar voice. Harold stumbled backward, nearly losing his footing on the icy ground. This is dangerous, Harold barked. This is illegal, James. Wild animals aren't pets. James raised his hands, palms open. He's not dangerous. Please just stay calm. He won't hurt you. But Solomon's presence, large, undeniable, filled the yard with an energy no reassurance could erase. The cub sensed the tension and released a low rumble. It wasn't a growl, but Harold recoiled anyway. That's it, Harold spat, already turning away. I'm calling animal control. And the sheriff. They'll take that thing before someone gets killed. James froze. The axe slipped from his hands and landed in the snow with a dull, hollow thud. Harold, wait, please. He's just a cub. He's not aggressive. But Harold never looked back. His boots crunched across the frost until his footsteps disappeared beyond the tree line. The silence that followed was suffocating. Solomon padded over and pressed his head against James's leg, sensing distress he couldn't understand. James sank to his knees, burying his fingers in the cub's warm fur, fighting the tremor rising in his chest. I'm sorry, buddy, he whispered. I've been selfish. I've been pretending we could outrun the world. Solomon gazed up at him, trusting innocent unknowing. The drive into town later that day felt heavier than any James had ever made. He placed 2 calls, the first to the sheriff's office, the second to a wildlife organization. His hands shook both times. He explained everything, the fire, the rescue, the months of care. He tried to make them understand that Solomon wasn't just an animal. He was family. But laws do not bend for love, and wild creatures do not become domestic simply because a man's heart wishes it so. By late afternoon, 2 trucks climbed the long dirt road toward the cabin. Their engines rumbled like distant thunder across the snow-bright clearing. Solomon, hearing the unfamiliar sound, pressed close to James' tail, lowered. A wildlife officer stepped out first, a woman with a gentle voice and sorrow in her eyes. Mr. Callahan, she said softly. James nodded. We're not here to punish you, she continued. We're here to protect the animal. He can't stay here, not safely, not legally. But we'll care for him, I promise. Promises. They were so easy to give, so easy to break. When the transport crate was unloaded, Solomon's rumble changed, confused at first, then edged with fear. James knelt beside him, his heart breaking as Solomon pressed closer, searching for safety. Hey, James whispered, forcing steadiness into his voice. It's okay. You're okay. I'm right here. Solomon's breathing turned shallow and quick. He didn't understand the uniforms, the crate, the sudden shift in his world. But he understood James, his touch, his voice, his presence. That understanding made the moment unbearable. It took long, agonizing minutes before Solomon allowed himself to be guided into the crate. Not because he trusted the officers, but because he trusted James. As the door was secured, James leaned close, pressing his forehead against the cold metal. You'll be safe, he whispered. They'll take you somewhere better. Somewhere with space, with sun, with everything you deserve. And I'll find you, I promise. Solomon released a low, trembling hum, the same sound from their first night together. Fear and faith tangled into one fragile note. When the truck finally rolled away, carrying Solomon into the deepening dusk, James stood in the cold until the taillights vanished completely. His hands hung useless at his sides, empty as if something vital had been torn away. Behind him, the cabin felt suddenly too quiet, too wide, too hollow. And though the officers promised he could visit the sanctuary once paperwork cleared, James knew deep in his bones that nothing would ever be the same. His life had changed the day he saved Solomon, and now it was changing again, only this time it was breaking. The cabin felt unbearably quiet after Solomon was taken away, so quiet that James could hear his own heartbeat at night thudding into the stillness like a reminder of something missing. The corners of the house seemed darker, the rooms colder, and every sound a creaking floorboard. The wind rattling through the eaves echoed with the absence of padded footsteps and a soft rumbling purr. Solomon had been gone only a day, yet the space he once filled was carved into every corner of the cabin. James moved from room to room like a ghost. The dish Solomon used to eat from sat exactly where he'd left it. A small rubber ball rested near the fireplace. The blanket Solomon slept on still held the faint impression of his body. Every step James took felt wrong, as if he were walking through a world that had forgotten how to include him. He lasted 2 weeks. 2 weeks before the silence grew too loud to bear. One morning, after another sleepless night staring at the ceiling until sunrise, James rose, folded Solomon's blanket, and placed it inside a worn duffel bag. He stood in the bathroom staring at his reflection, lined face, tired eyes, and made a decision. Within hours, he packed only the essentials, locked the cabin door behind him, and drove west until the mountains gave way to the California coast. He told himself he needed a fresh start, but he knew the truth. He went to be closer to Solomon. Solomon had been transferred to the San Diego Safari Wildlife Park, a sanctuary known for its wide enclosures and focus on rehabilitation. Visitors weren't allowed to interact directly with the lions, but they were allowed to watch. And for James, even that was enough. Even seeing Solomon through glass would have to be enough. James found a small rental near the park, a modest apartment with peeling paint, a flickering porch light, and a narrow balcony that faced the direction of the reserve. It wasn't much, but after the cabin it felt practical. A place built not for memories, but for what remained of his purpose. The first time James saw Solomon again was 6 months later. Solomon was no longer a cub. He had tripled in size, sleek, muscular, his gait confident and commanding. His mane had begun to grow still short, but already dark along the edges. He looked every bit the wild creature he was meant to be. James approached the thick safety glass, heart pounding. Solomon froze mid-step. His ears flicked forward. His muscles tensed not with fear, but with something closer to alertness. Recognition. James raised a trembling hand and pressed his palm against the glass. Solomon walked toward him, slow, deliberate steps, until his massive face was just inches away. He lowered his head slightly and exhaled his breath, fogging the glass for a brief moment. James swallowed hard. "Hey there," he whispered. "You look good, buddy." Solomon rumbled a low, deep sound, almost questioning. A keeper passing by paused. "Huh. That's odd," she said. "He doesn't usually come this close to people. Guess he likes you." James didn't respond. He was afraid his voice would break if he tried. From that day on, James visited every single Sunday. He arrived when the gates opened, always wearing the same faded denim jacket, always holding a cup of coffee he barely touched. He sat on the same bench, the one closest to Solomon's enclosure, and waited. And every Sunday, without fail, Solomon came. He didn't pace like he sometimes did with crowds. He didn't roar. He simply stood there, watching James with calm, steady eyes that carried the patience of something ancient. Years slipped by. James aged in ways he didn't notice until they became impossible to ignore. His hands trembled more often. His knees stiffened. His breath grew shorter on the uphill walk from the parking lot. Still, he never missed a Sunday, not one. Not when doctors told him to slow down. Not during storms that flooded the roads. Not during heat waves that turned the asphalt into shimmering mirrors. James came, and Solomon always met him. The keepers talked quietly about the strange bond between the old man and the lion. Some believed Solomon associated James with positive memories from early handling. Others thought he recognized his scent from a time before the sanctuary. None of them understood how unwavering it was. Solomon grew into a dominant male, the largest in his pride. His mane thickened into dark waves, nearly black at the tips. Scars marked his flanks, earned from defending territory and asserting dominance. Yet every Sunday, the fierce predator softened into something else entirely, something gentle. Visitors often whispered when they saw it, a massive lion sitting quietly at the glass, watching an elderly man speak to him in low, tender tones. Some took photos. A few recorded videos. Most simply stood in silence, sensing they were witnessing something rare. James didn't care about the attention. His world narrowed to that quiet space between them. He told Solomon everything about missing Clara, about the fire station he sometimes drove past, just to remember what purpose once felt like, about letters from his daughter, about the constant ache in his bones. He joked about growing old, about how Solomon seemed to age far better than he did. Sometimes Solomon tilted his head the same way he had as a cub, and each time James's voice softened. Years became a decade. Then, too, James's hair turned silver white. His shoulders sagged. His steps shortened. Still, every Sunday, his hand rested lightly against the glass, offering what warmth his body had left. And Solomon answered every time with the same slow blink, the same deep rumble, the same quiet devotion. One Sunday morning, a younger keeper named Maya approached James. "You know," she said gently, "we've been watching this for years. I don't think he recognizes you the way we usually think of recognition." She hesitated. "I think he remembers how you made him feel safe. Loved. That kind of memory runs deeper than sight or sound." James nodded, blinking back tears. "Maybe so," he murmured. When Solomon arrived moments later, James whispered, "You remember, don't you, boy? Not everything, but enough." Solomon exhaled against the glass, fogging it once more. And for James, that breath meant more than words ever could. Another year passed. James found himself pausing more often on the walk from the parking lot. His heart fluttered in ways that worried him, but he ignored it. His time with Solomon mattered more than discomfort, more than the weakness creeping into his body. One Sunday afternoon, after a visit that left him unusually breathless, James lingered longer than usual. Solomon had wandered off to nap on a distant rock too far away to see him, but James waited anyway. He stayed until the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the enclosure. As he finally turned to leave, James whispered to himself, "I'll be back next week. You can count on it." He didn't know those words would soon matter more than he ever imagined, because the world was about to crack open once again, this time not with fire, but with fate. The morning began like any other. Sunlight warmed the pavement. Children tugged at their parents, pointing eagerly at wildlife maps. The sweet smell of popcorn drifted from the concession stands. Nothing hinted at the catastrophe waiting to unfold. Nothing suggested that by noon the San Diego Safari Wildlife Park would become the stage for a moment the world would never forget. James arrived later than usual that Sunday. His breath came short. His steps were slower. On the uphill path, he stopped twice, gripping the railing, willing his heart to behave just a little longer. He had promised Solomon he would come. He had whispered that promise into the fading light the week before, not knowing why it felt heavier than all the others. When he reached the lion enclosure, something was wrong. Visitors weren't gathered at the viewing glass. Instead, clusters of people stood frozen across the plaza, whispering urgently. A security alarm pulsed faintly in the distance, layered with hurried footsteps and clipped radio chatter. Before James could piece it together, the loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention all guests. Please proceed calmly to designated exits. This is a safety protocol. Staff will assist you." But calm was already gone. Children cried. Parents clutched hands too tightly. Teenagers sprinted toward the gates. Panic rose not all at once, but creeping, contagious. James moved against the flow. Then he heard it. A roar. Not one of dominance, not one of rage. A roar of distress. It tore through the air so deep it vibrated in James's chest. He didn't run. He followed the sound until he saw it. The far wall of the lion enclosure, one of the reinforced gates, had collapsed inward. Metal twisted like softened wax. Dust churned through the air as keepers shouted orders. And there, standing in the breach main, swept back by the coastal wind, eyes blazing with instinct and fear, was Solomon. Even from a distance, James saw it, the trembling rise and fall of Solomon's chest, the frantic flick of his tail, the uncertainty in his stance. The lion wasn't charging. He wasn't attacking. He was searching. Then everything happened at once. Solomon leapt through the opening, landing heavily on the plaza pavement. Guests scattered in every direction. A stroller tipped over. Someone screamed. A man dragged his wife behind a kiosk. Officers raised tranquilizer rifles, hands shaking. James's heart cracked not with fear, but with understanding, confusion, instinct, and beneath it all, longing. Everyone back, a guard shouted, "Clear the plaza!" In the chaos, a small girl, no more than 4 or 5, slipped from her mother's grasp. She fell to her knees less than 10 yards from Solomon. Her mother screamed her name. The child froze, eyes wide, trapped between crawling and running. Solomon turned toward her, not aggressively, but drawn by movement, fear, innocence. The world snapped tight around James. There was no calculation, no hesitation. He stepped forward. Not fast, not slow. Steady, like a man walking toward truth. People shouted for him to stop. A ranger grabbed his sleeve, but James slipped free, barely aware of the hands reaching out. His pulse thundered as he crossed the open plaza, the crowd peeling away as if the ground itself were giving him space. Solomon shifted, torn between instinct and something older. His jaws parted slightly, teeth catching the sunlight. Then James spoke. Just one word. "Solomon." The lion froze mid-breath. His massive head turned slowly, painfully, until his eyes met James's. Recognition flashed. First a spark, then a blaze. James's vision blurred with tears. "It's me, buddy," he said softly. "I'm here." Solomon took a step. Then another. His tail lowered, his ears tilted forward, listening, remembering. The child whimpered and scrambled backward into her mother's arms. The space between man and lion opened clear and still. The plaza went silent. Tranquilizer rifles lowered but did not fire. Guards froze mid-command. Even the wind seemed to pause. And in that suspended moment, James kept walking. "I'm right here, Solomon." His voice trembled. "You're okay. You're safe now." A deep rumble rose from Solomon's chest, a sound James hadn't heard in 20 years. Not since a small cub had slept curled against him on cold desert nights. It rolled across the plaza like memory-made sound. Then Solomon closed the distance. One step, then another, each more certain than the last. When he reached James, the great lion lowered his head slowly, reverently, until his forehead rested against James's chest. It wasn't dominance. It wasn't threat. It was a homecoming. James's hands shook as they lifted fingers, sinking into the thick mane he once brushed with a damp cloth when it was barely more than a tuft. Solomon leaned into him, pressing hard enough that James staggered, but the lion shifted instinctively, supporting him. A purr rose from Solomon's throat, loud, vibrating, impossibly gentle. The plaza erupted not with screams, but with tears. People covered their mouths. A woman whispered, "My God, he knows him." James pressed his cheek into Solomon's fur. "You remembered?" he whispered. "You remembered." Solomon lifted his head and licked James's cheek, one long, familiar swipe, wild and affectionate, just like he had as a cub. James laughed through tears, the sound raw, breaking apart decades of grief. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "You're still strong as ever." A handler whispered urgently, "We need to get him back inside. But we can't interrupt this. Look at them." No one moved. Because in that moment, the plaza wasn't witnessing danger. They were witnessing devotion. James cupped Solomon's massive cheek. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." Solomon blinked slowly, the ancient language of trust. A promise returned. And as James leaned into Solomon's mane, he felt something close within him, like a circle completed, like a prayer answered, like a grace he never thought he would live long enough to receive. Even after Solomon was safely guided back through the repaired gate, even after the plaza slowly reclaimed its fractured sense of order, the air still carried the echo of something extraordinary. Within hours, videos of the reunion spread across the world. News stations replayed the footage on endless loops. Social media overflowed with disbelief, tears, and wonder. Reporters gathered outside the park like migrating birds hungry for a statement, a headline, anything that could explain what logic could not. But James wanted none of it. He wanted only time. Moved by what they had witnessed, and by what could not be undone, the park administration made a rare decision. It wasn't written in policy. It wasn't required by law. It was simply the decent thing to do. James Callahan was granted special permission to visit Solomon directly. Not in the plaza, not behind glass, but behind the scenes through the quiet service corridors known only to keepers. The visits would be monitored, controlled, and brief. Still to James, it felt like a long-lost dream gently returned. Every Thursday morning before the park opened and before cameras crowded the paths, James entered through the staff gate. The air back there felt different, cooler, heavier, carrying the earthy scent of straw, soil, and animal musk. Far from the polished concrete and cheerful noise of tourists, keepers nodded when they saw him pass. Some smiled softly. Some lowered their eyes in quiet respect. All of them understood they were witnessing something rare. When James reached the safety partition outside Solomon's den, the lion was already there. Always, Solomon would rise from the padded floor, his mane brushing the overhead lights, and walk straight to the bars. He pressed his massive forehead against the steel, releasing a deep, rolling rumble that vibrated through the metal and into James's arms the moment he touched it. James would sit on a small wooden stool they kept just for him. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he didn't. "You look good today," he'd say. "My knees are killing me, but you're worth every step." And on days when his voice trembled with exhaustion, he would whisper, "You remember us, don't you? Even if it's just the feeling." Each time Solomon answered with a slow blink, the sacred gesture of trust among felines. Weeks turned into months. James's health declined in ways he pretended not to notice. His hands shook more often. His breath shortened faster. Some mornings even sitting felt like work. Still, every Thursday he came, leaning heavier on the railings, gripping his jacket tighter, murmuring to himself as he walked one more visit. Just one more. The keepers grew protective of him. Maya, the young keeper with kind eyes, often walked beside him. "Take your time, James," she'd say gently. "He's not going anywhere." James would smile faintly. "I know," he replied. "I just don't want him waiting." One cold Thursday morning, clouds smothered the California sun. A thin mist clung to the ground, blurring the park's edges into something dreamlike. James arrived early, wrapped in a scarf Clara had knitted decades ago. The threads were frayed, the colors softened by time. As he passed through the service gate, something inside him felt different, heavy, final, but not frightening. He made it halfway down the corridor before Maya noticed his steps slowing. "You okay?" she asked quietly. James nodded once. "Just tired," he whispered. But when they turned the corner and Solomon came into view, James straightened not from strength, but from instinct. Solomon moved faster than usual, his paws deliberate, his tail low. His eyes locked onto James with an intensity that silenced the corridor. James smiled and lifted a trembling hand. "There you are," he breathed. "My boy." He lowered himself onto the stool, exhaling as his hand rested against the bars. Solomon pressed his massive head as close as he could, his rumble deep and steady. The vibration traveled through the metal, through James's arm, into his chest. James closed his eyes. "You know," he murmured, his voice worn and gentle. "I never thought I'd get this far. Thought I'd lost you for good. But life surprised me." Solomon brushed his muzzle along the bars as if trying to close the distance. His rumble deepened, grounding, protective. James let out a quiet, breathless laugh. "Still purring after all these years," he said. "Guess some instincts never fade." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the cool metal. "I'm tired, Solomon," he whispered. I think this is my last Thursday." Maya froze. Solomon's rumble faltered, replaced by a soft, uncertain sound, low, almost pleading. His amber eyes widened, reflecting something raw and ancient. James smiled. "Hey." "None of that," he said gently. "You gave me more years than I deserved, more love than I ever expected. And I hope," his voice thinned to a fragile thread, "I hope I made you feel safe even when the world wasn't." Solomon pressed harder into the bars. His body trembled once, just once, before going still. James reached through the narrow gap, fingers brushing the mane he had once towel-dried as a cub. "Thank you," he whispered, "for remembering me, for coming back to me, for being my friend." His hand lingered in Solomon's fur, then slowly slipped away, settling against his knee. James exhaled softly and did not inhale again. Maya rushed forward, calling his name, her voice breaking. Another keeper ran for medical staff. But deep down, they all knew. James Callahan had passed the way he had lived, quietly, tenderly, with devotion etched deep into his bones. Solomon did not move. He did not roar, he did not pace, he did not strike the bars. He lay down where he was, pressing his massive body as close as the enclosure allowed. He lowered his head to the spot where James's hand had always rested. His mane spread across the floor like a golden shadow. His breath warmed the metal. His eyes stayed open, watching, guarding. When the medical team arrived, Solomon remained still, even as they lifted James gently away, even as the corridor filled with hushed voices and trembling hands. Hours passed before Solomon finally rose. He stepped back slowly, heavily, each movement carrying a weight that made even the keepers turn away, unable to hide their tears. He looked once at the empty stool, then toward the corridor where James had been taken, and at last he turned and walked back into the den. The world would remember the dramatic reunion, the viral videos, the miracle in the plaza, but those who witnessed that final quiet Thursday knew the deeper truth. A lion remembered the man who saved him, and a man spent his final breath keeping a promise he had made to a frightened cub in the dark. Some bonds are not broken by time, some love needs no words, and some stories do not end in tragedy, but in the quiet grace of having found each other at all. If this story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments. If it awakened a memory of your own, leave a 0. Your small gesture means more than you know. And if you'd like to hear more true stories of love, loyalty, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe and stay with the channel. Thank you for watching.